Why did her hands start shaking before the briefing even began? Captain Grace Donnelly sat at the far end of the table, helmet resting between her boots, flight gloves folded too neatly beside it. The room smelled like recycled air and burnt coffee, the kind that lingered on forward operating bases no matter how often they scrubbed the walls. Around her, voices overlapped, updates, coordinates, dry humor meant to cut tension, but none of it reached her. Her eyes stayed on the screen at the front of the room, frozen on a still image of a compound carved into the hills beyond the border. She had flown dozens of missions like this. Insert, observe, cover, extract, clean and quiet, but something about this one felt off, not dangerous, not urgent, personal. Donnelly. She looked up too fast. The room went quiet. Your lead overwatch, the operations officer said. Long-range precision. You see anything move that shouldn't, you make the call. Grace nodded once. No questions, no objections, that was her reputation now. Reliable, controlled, silent. No one in that room knew she hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night in months. No one noticed the faint scar along her wrist, hidden beneath the cuff of her uniform. No one asked why she always sat near the door. And she didn't offer. Because once, years ago, she had offered something far simpler than fire support. A cup of coffee, a seat, a refusal to look away. And it had cost her everything. The rotors beat the air into submission as the helicopter lifted, desert lights shrinking below them. Grace clipped in, eyes scanning instinctively, muscle memory doing what it always did. But inside her chest, the same question circled again and again. If the moment comes, will I stand the same way again? The compound appeared through her scope just before dawn. She lay prone on the ridge, rifle steady, breath measured. The world narrowed to angles and distance and heat signatures. She was good at this part, too good. Precision didn't require permission, just clarity. Movement flickered near the outer wall, a shape, then another. Grace adjusted, zoomed, and froze. A dog. Not feral, not wandering, tactical vest, handler close behind, limping. Her finger tightened, then stopped. Overwatch confirm hostile, the voice crackled in her ear. Grace didn't answer right away. The image on her scope blurred, not from distance but memory. A cafe floor, a red service vest, a man who hadn't spoken in weeks until someone told him to leave. I need another 5 seconds, she said. Silence stretched. Those 5 seconds saved 3 lives. Later, when the debrief ended and the room emptied, no one praised her restraint. No one reprimanded her either. They just nodded, logged the outcome, moved on. That was the thing about Grace Donnelly. She wasn't loud enough to celebrate. But she was never invisible when it mattered. She lay on her bunk that night, boots still on, staring at the ceiling. The base generator hummed. Somewhere, someone laughed too loudly. Someone else cried quietly. Grace closed her eyes and saw the cafe again. Saw herself untying an apron. Saw a door closing behind her. Saw a phone camera lifted just before everything changed. She had been a civilian then, a widow, a woman holding grief together with routine and kindness. Now she wore rank. Now she carried authority. Now she was trusted with life and death. But the question hadn't changed. Who do you protect when the rules tell you not to? The mission ended without ceremony. They always did. Grace rotated back stateside 2 weeks later, her name moving quietly through channels that didn't make announcements. She was reassigned, then reassigned again. Until one morning, she stood alone on a flight line as a colonel she didn't recognize waited beside a black sedan. Captain Donnelly, he said, you're needed somewhere else. She didn't ask where. She never did. The building had no signage, no flags, just concrete and glass and guards who didn't smile. Inside, a woman in civilian clothes waited, early 40s, calm eyes, the kind that had seen things and survived by choosing carefully what to feel. "We've reviewed your record," the woman said. "Your missions, your decisions, your pauses." Grace said nothing. "There was an incident years ago in a cafe." Grace's jaw tightened. "We know," the woman continued. "You were fired for refusing to remove a veteran and his service dog." Silence. "That moment," she said gently, "is why you're here. They didn't offer medals. They didn't promise safety. They offered purpose. A role that didn't exist on paper. A mission without applause. A responsibility that required judgment more than obedience." Grace accepted without hesitation. Because some people don't stop serving. They just change uniforms. The work was slow, unnamed, unrecorded. Grace moved through cities like a shadow, sometimes in civilian clothes, sometimes not. She trained teams to read silence, to notice who flinched, who didn't sit with their back to doors, who needed space more than questions. She brought dogs into rooms where words failed. She taught operators when not to pull triggers. She failed sometimes. Those nights hurt the most. On one mission, a young corporal froze under pressure. The aftermath was messy, investigated, reviewed. Grace sat across from him, hours later, in a concrete room with no windows. He wouldn't look up. "I didn't know what to do," he whispered. Grace slid a cup of coffee across the table. "You didn't need to know," she said. "You just needed to stay." He did. Years passed. Grace's name never trended. Her face never appeared on recruitment posters. But quietly, programs changed. Protocols shifted. People were treated like people more often than before. Then one afternoon, on a base she hadn't visited in over a decade, she walked past a small wellness center near the motor pool. A familiar smell drifted out. Coffee. Inside, a chalkboard read, "This is a place to be seen, not fixed." Grace stood there longer than she meant to. A young woman approached, service dog at her side. "Is it okay if we sit?" she asked, nervous. Grace smiled. It always was. That night, alone in her quarters, Grace removed her uniform and hung it carefully. From her bag, she took out an old photograph. A cafe. A man in jeans. A woman smiling without knowing what was coming. She pinned it to the wall. No rank. No citation. Just memory. Grace Donnelly never set out to be an example. She never wanted recognition. She never chased redemption. She just refused, again and again, to abandon dignity when it was inconvenient. And in a world that often rewards silence over courage, she chose something quieter. Consistency. Presence. The strength to stand still when everything else said move. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did she hesitate when the order came through her headset? The words were clear, calm, procedural. Overwatch, green light, confirm and engage. Grace Donnelly lay motionless against the cold earth, rifle pressed into her shoulder, cheek welded to the stock the way she'd been trained to do years ago. Wind moved across the ridgeline in slow, patient breaths. Somewhere below, a generator coughed. A door slammed. A life continued, unaware of how close it was to ending. Her finger rested inside the trigger guard. Not squeezing. Not yet. Through the scope, the compound breathed. Heat signatures bloomed and faded as people shifted inside thick mud walls. A man stepped into the courtyard, stretching, rubbing his face like someone waking up too early. He wasn't armed. He wasn't marked. He was just there. Grace adjusted her breathing, in for 4, hold, out for 6. "Donnelly," the voice came again, tighter this time. "We're on the clock." She knew that tone. It meant patience was thinning. It meant someone higher up was watching numbers scroll across a screen and waiting for certainty. Certainty was the problem, because certainty was easy when you didn't see faces. Grace saw them. She always did. Her mind flickered uninvited to another morning. Not a ridgeline, not a scope. A cafe floor still warm from sunlight, mugs clinking softly, steam rising like it had something to say. A man sitting too rigid in his chair. A dog at his feet, alert but calm. A voice saying, "That animal is a violation." Grace swallowed. "Stand by," she said. Her voice was steady, but her pulse was. Below, the man in the courtyard bent down and picked something up. A child's shoe. Too small for the boots scattered near the door. He brushed dirt from it, turned it over in his hands like it mattered. Grace's chest tightened. She didn't think of rules. She didn't think of consequences. She thought of Ray McMillan's hands wrapped too tightly around a coffee mug. Of how they'd stopped shaking only after Shadow lay down, solid and breathing, proof that something in the world still stayed. "I don't have confirmation," Grace said quietly. Silence on the line. Then irritation. "Donnelly, we don't need a biography, we need a call." Her jaw set. "This isn't it," she said. "Not yet." Seconds dragged. Sweat ran down her spine despite the cold. She knew what refusing too long could cost. She knew how thin the margin was between trust and insubordination. But she also knew this feeling. It was the same one she'd had standing behind a counter years ago, heart pounding, knowing the next sentence would change everything. Below, another figure emerged, older, slower. He leaned on a cane, limped into the light. He raised his voice, not shouting, just calling back toward the doorway. A woman answered, a child followed. Grace exhaled. "Negative," she said, "non-combatants present." The line went dead for half a second, then orders shifted, extraction delayed, angles recalculated. Lives moved forward instead of ending. Grace stayed prone long after the threat window passed, muscles aching, mind louder than the radio chatter now filling her ears. When the mission wrapped, no one mentioned her pause. They logged it as judgment, discretion, acceptable deviation. But Grace knew better. She hadn't paused because of training. She'd paused because once, when the moment came, she'd chosen dignity over compliance, and it had burned her life down to the studs. And somehow she'd survived. Back on base, the days blurred into routines she could execute in her sleep. Briefings, simulations, after-action reports stripped of emotion. Grace moved through them all like a ghost with purpose. She was respected but not close to anyone, trusted but not invited. She ate alone when she could, trained longer than required, volunteered for the slots others avoided. At night, when the barracks quieted, she lay awake listening to the hum of electricity in the walls. That was when the memories came. Not the explosions, not the blood. The quieter things. The way her apron strings had trembled when she untied them. The way no one followed her out the door, even though they wanted to. The way the sunlight had felt too bright for a woman who just lost her place in the world. She hadn't cried that day. She'd waited until she was alone in her truck, hands locked around the steering wheel, chest tight with something that felt like both grief and relief. Because she'd known. She'd known she'd do it again. That knowledge had scared her more than losing the job. The knock on her door came just after 2200. Grace rolled off her bunk, boots already halfway on by instinct. She opened the door to find a senior warrant officer she barely recognized. "You're being reassigned," he said. "No preamble, pack light." "Where?" Grace asked. He hesitated, "Somewhere quieter." They didn't brief her until the wheels were already off the ground. The aircraft droned steadily, lights dim, faces unreadable. A folder slid across the narrow table between seats. Inside were photos, names, places blurred by intention, and one familiar image. A cafe. Not her cafe, but close enough to make her chest ache. This operation, the briefing officer said, requires someone who understands discretion, someone who knows when not to act. Grace closed the folder. I understand, she said. The location was small, unremarkable, the kind of place people forgot existed unless they needed something from it. Grace blended easily there, moving through streets with practiced anonymity. Her role wasn't to shoot. It was to notice. She watched patterns, timings, who lingered and who avoided eye contact. She learned which doors stayed unlocked too late and which ones never opened at all. And she listened. Not just to conversations, but to silence. One afternoon, tucked into the corner of a market, she saw a man sitting against a wall with a dog curled tightly against his legs. The dog's vest was faded. The man's hands shook as he tried to light a cigarette. People stepped around them like they weren't there. Grace felt the familiar pull. She bought 2 bottles of water, walked over, squatted down, slow, careful. Mind if I sit? She asked. The man looked up startled, then nodded. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. The dog lifted its head, eyes sharp, assessing, then relaxed. Grace left the water between them when she stood. That night she wrote in her notebook, not mission notes, not reports. Just names, places, small observations. She kept the notebook since the cafe days. It was worn now, pages soft from handling. Someone once told her it was unprofessional. She never listened. The operation concluded without headlines. No raids, no dramatic extractions, just quiet changes. People moved. Threats dissolved before they could form. Grace's superiors called it success. Grace called it restraint. When she returned stateside, there was no ceremony, just a handshake, a new assignment waiting. She stood in the hangar for a long moment after everyone else dispersed, helmet under her arm, watching the empty space where the aircraft had been. A young lieutenant lingered nearby, clearly working up the nerve to speak. "Ma'am," he said finally. Grace turned. "I just wanted to say," he hesitated, searching for words, "the way you handle things, you don't rush, you don't forget people." Grace studied him. He reminded her of someone, younger, before the weight settled in. "Don't confuse patience with hesitation," she said gently. "One is fear, the other is respect." He nodded, absorbing it like doctrine. That night, alone again, Grace pinned a new photo to the wall above her bunk. It wasn't official, just a snapshot she'd taken on her phone before leaving the market. A man. A dog. 2 shadows touching in late afternoon light. No faces, no names. Just proof. Grace lay back, hands folded on her chest, and let the quiet settle. She knew the road ahead wouldn't get easier. People like her were always needed, but rarely understood. Still, when the moment came again, and it always did, she knew what she would choose. Not the fastest option. Not the loudest. Not the one that looked best on paper. She would choose the one that let her live with herself afterward. Because strength, she'd learned, wasn't about pulling the trigger. It was about knowing when not to. Why did her name suddenly stop appearing on the rotation board? Grace noticed it on a Tuesday. Those were usually predictable, training slots posted by 600, names shuffled but familiar, the rhythm of a system that thrived on order. She stood with a paper cup of bitter coffee in her hand, eyes scanning the board out of habit more than concern. Her name wasn't there. She checked again, slowly, line by line. Others noticed too. She felt it before anyone said anything, the slight shift in posture when she entered the room, the way conversation softened, then resumed without her. Not hostile, not suspicious. Careful. Grace finished her coffee and tossed the cup without looking. She didn't ask questions. She learned long ago that questions, when asked too early, had a way of closing doors you didn't even know existed yet. Still, something tightened in her chest. Being unseen was one thing. Being quietly removed was another. That afternoon, she was called into an office she'd never been in before, smaller than command spaces. No flags, no framed citations, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out onto nothing of interest. A man waited inside. Civilian, gray hair, no rank on his chest, but authority sat on him anyway. "Captain Donnelly," he said, standing, "have a seat." She did. "We've been reviewing your operational history," he began, folding his hands. "You have a pattern." Grace didn't respond. "You delay engagements. You redirect resources. You prioritize containment over elimination." "Yes," she said. "That's not always aligned with directive intent." Grace met his gaze. "It's aligned with outcome." He studied her for a long moment, like someone deciding whether a piece on the board was expendable or simply misunderstood. "Do you consider yourself disobedient, Captain?" he asked. Grace thought of the cafe, of the clipboard, of the word final spoken without anger. "No," she said evenly. "I consider myself accountable." The man leaned back slightly. Accountable to whom? That was the question, wasn't it? Grace exhaled slowly. "To the people who live with the consequences after we leave." Silence filled the room, not tense, evaluative. Finally, the man nodded once. "That's why your name isn't on the board," he said. "You're being reassigned, again." Grace felt it then, not fear, not relief. A familiar ache. Because reassignment didn't always mean advancement. Sometimes it meant distance, isolation, a slow fade into places where mistakes could be buried along with the people who made them. "Where?" she asked. The man slid a folder across the desk. Inside were images that didn't look like battlefields. Schools, clinics, markets, places where lines between civilian and combatant blurred into something morally exhausting. "Domestic," he said. "Advisory capacity, low visibility." Grace nodded. "When do I leave?" "Tonight." She packed in silence. She always did. Her belongings fit into one duffel without effort. A few uniforms, boots worn just enough to feel honest. The notebook. She paused with it in her hands, thumb brushing the frayed edge of the cover. Names filled those pages, not just contacts, people. Some crossed out, some circled, some followed by question marks that never got answered. Grace tucked it carefully into the side pocket. The drive took hours. The landscape changed slowly, concrete giving way to trees, fences to open fields. The facility she arrived at barely registered as military. No signage, no ceremony. Inside, the atmosphere felt heavier, quieter, like a place that absorbed things rather than projected them. Grace was briefed quickly. Her role was advisory, but that word felt insufficient. She was there to evaluate behavior, predict reactions, intervene before situations escalated beyond repair. She was there because she noticed things other people overlooked. The first case came sooner than expected. A local joint task force had flagged a former contractor, male, late 40s, combat history scattered across multiple theaters, recently volatile, recently unemployed, recently divorced, recently invisible. Grace requested to observe before action was taken. "They want us ready," the team lead said, "if he turns hostile." "He hasn't," Grace replied. "Yet." Grace nodded. "Yet." They watched from a distance. The man lived alone in a small house on the edge of town, curtains drawn, lights on at odd hours, no visitors. Except one. A dog. Medium-sized mutt, loyal to a fault. Grace watched the man sit on his front steps every evening, dog pressed against his leg, hand resting absently on its head like it was the only solid thing left in his world. She felt the pull again. On the third day, Grace requested permission to make contact. The team hesitated. "You're not law enforcement," someone pointed out. "I know," she said. "That's why it might work." They agreed reluctantly. Grace approached in civilian clothes, hands visible, posture open but alert. The dog noticed her immediately, ears lifting, body shifting protectively. She stopped several feet away. "Hey," she said softly, "mind if I ask you a question?" The man squinted up at her. "Depends." She nodded, "Fair." They talked for 20 minutes, about nothing important, weather, the dog, the way the town had changed. Grace didn't ask about his record, didn't mention the reports, didn't rush. At the end, she stood. "I'm around if you need anything," she said. "Coffee on me." He scoffed. "Why?" Grace met his eyes. "Because someone did that for me once." She walked away without waiting for a response. That night, the team waited for escalation. It never came. Over the next week, the man started leaving his curtains open. He shaved. He smiled at the clerk at the gas station. He brought the dog to the park. The file was downgraded, then closed. Grace's report was short. Threat neutralized through presence. The phrase raised eyebrows. But it worked. Still, not everyone appreciated her methods. Whispers followed her through hallways, too soft, too hesitant, too emotional. Grace absorbed it all without reaction. Until one evening, sitting alone in the mess hall, she overheard two junior officers talking behind her. "She's good," one said, "but I don't know if I trust someone who pauses that much." Grace didn't turn around. The other officer shrugged. "Yeah, makes you wonder what she's thinking." Grace finished her meal slowly, carefully. She wondered the same thing sometimes. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat on her bunk, boots unlaced, staring at the wall. Her reflection stared back faintly in the glass of the window. She thought of her husband, of the way he used to pause before answering big questions, how people mistook it for uncertainty. It hadn't been. It had been care. Grace lay back and closed her eyes. If I stop pausing, she thought, what do I become? Weeks passed, then months. Her assignments continued, quiet successes, no commendations, no reprimands. Until the call came. Different tone, different urgency. A situation developing fast. A woman barricaded in a building near a base. Former intelligence analyst. PTSD flagged but untreated. Armed but not aggressive. "She's asking for you," the voice on the line said. Grace sat up. "For me." She mentioned the cafe. Grace's breath caught. It took hours to reach the site. By the time she arrived, floodlights cut harsh lines across the building. Tactical teams waited tense. Grace approached the perimeter and raised a hand. "I'll go alone," she said. Arguments followed, protocols cited. Grace didn't raise her voice. "She won't talk to anyone else," she said, "and if we rush this, someone dies." Reluctantly, they let her pass. Grace stepped inside slowly, announcing herself with each step. "I'm Grace," she called. "I brought coffee." Silence. Then a voice shaking. "I don't deserve it." Grace stopped. "Yes," she said gently, "you do." The standoff ended without gunfire. Later, sitting on the curb as medics worked, the woman looked at Grace with wet eyes. "You're the one," she whispered, "from the video." Grace nodded. "I thought if you could stand up like that, maybe I could sit down." Grace swallowed hard. Sometimes, the echo of a single moment traveled farther than we ever knew. That night back in her quarters, Grace opened her notebook and added a new line. She didn't write a name. She wrote a sentence. Paused, listened, stayed. Grace closed the notebook and rested her hands on top of it. She still didn't know where this path would lead. But she knew why she stayed on it. Because not every mission was about winning. Some were about making sure no one disappeared unnoticed. And that, she had learned, was a form of service too. Why did her hands feel heavier when the building finally went quiet? Grace sat on the curb with her back against the armored vehicle, helmet resting beside her boots, the night air cool against skin still buzzing with adrenaline. Red and blue lights painted the street in slow pulses, stretching shadows across cracked pavement. The woman they'd pulled out alive was wrapped in a thermal blanket now, rocking slightly, breathing through tears that hadn't known where to go for a long time. No shots fired. No casualties. It should have felt like relief. Instead, Grace felt hollow. She watched the medics work, their movements efficient, detached. She recognized that look, the one that came after holding yourself together just long enough. When it all stopped, something inside loosened. Not peace. Wait. Someone approached. She didn't look up. "You did good," a voice said. Grace recognized it anyway. Colonel Gaines. He stood a few feet away, hands clasped behind his back, gaze scanning the scene with a commander's distance and a father's concern. He hadn't been supposed to be here. That meant the situation had traveled further up the chain than anyone admitted. Grace nodded once. She did most of it. Gaines crouched slightly, lowering himself to her level without invading her space. "You always say that." Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Because it's true," she replied. "All I did was not make it worse." Gaines studied her face, then followed her gaze to the woman in the blanket. "That's a rarer skill than people think." They sat in silence for a moment. Sirens faded. Radios crackled with cleanup chatter. Somewhere a dog barked, sharp and lonely. Grace closed her eyes briefly. That sound did it. When she opened them again, her vision blurred, not from exhaustion, but from the sudden, unwelcome pressure behind her eyes. She turned her face away before Gaines could notice. He noticed anyway. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Grace shrugged. "I don't know how to be when it's over." Gaines nodded like he understood too well. Most people don't. The drive back to base was quiet. Grace watched the city slide past the window, lights flickering like memories she couldn't quite place. She replayed the woman's voice in her head. "I don't deserve it." Grace knew that sentence, had lived inside it once. Back in her quarters, she sat on the edge of her bunk and stared at the wall. Her body was tired, but her mind refused to follow. The notebook lay on the small table beside her, closed. She didn't open it. Instead, she pulled off her boots and leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands dangling uselessly between them. For the first time in a long while, she wondered how long she could keep doing this. Not the missions. The pauses. The carrying. The quiet accumulation of other people's breaking points. She'd always believed strength meant holding the line, staying upright when everything else gave way. But tonight, the line felt thin. Her wrist ached, a phantom sensation that came when she was too tired to keep the past contained. She rubbed it absently, breath hitching as the memory surfaced without warning. The cafe door. The sunlight. The way her name had sounded when it was spoken like a dismissal. "You're done here, Grace." She told herself she was over it, that the life she'd built since proved it didn't matter. But sitting alone in a quiet room, she wasn't so sure. The knock came just after midnight. Grace tensed, instincts flaring. She stood, pulled the door open. It was Gaines again. "I know it's late," he said, "but I didn't want to wait." He held out a folder. Grace took it reluctantly. "What is this?" "An offer," he said, "or maybe a question." She flipped it open. Inside were proposals, frameworks, pilot programs, pages filled with language about transition support, de-escalation units, non-kinetic intervention models. Her name appeared more than once. "They want you to help build this," Gaines said. "Not in theory, in practice." Grace closed the folder slowly. "You know I'm not polished," she said. "I don't play well with committees." Gaines smiled faintly. "That's exactly why they need you." She looked at him then, really looked. "Why now?" she asked. Gaines exhaled. "Because what you did tonight wasn't an exception. It was a pattern, and patterns eventually get noticed." Grace felt the weight shift again. Not lighter, different. "And if I say no?" she asked. Gaines didn't hesitate. "Then you keep doing what you're doing until it breaks you, or until someone decides they're uncomfortable with it." Grace nodded. That was honest. "I need time," she said. "You have it," Gaines replied, "but not forever." After he left, Grace sat back down, folder unopened on the table. She stared at it like it might start speaking on its own. Leadership, responsibility, visibility, all the things she'd learned to avoid. Her gaze drifted to the wall where the small collection of photos hung. Missions without captions, faces without names, a life stitched together by moments no one else remembered. She reached up and touched the edge of the cafe photo. Had that been the beginning? Or had it just revealed something that was already there? The next day she requested leave. Not long, just enough to breathe. She drove without destination at first, letting the road decide. Eventually, muscle memory took over. Mason, Georgia. The town hadn't changed much. Same flags, same hardware store, same quiet pride in small things. Grace parked a block away from the cafe before she realized what she was doing. She sat in the truck, engine off, watching people come and go. A new sign hung in the window now, different name, same warmth. She didn't go in. Not yet. Instead, she walked the sidewalk, past familiar corners, letting the past sit beside her instead of on top of her. Near the park, she saw a man sitting on a bench with a dog curled at his feet. The dog lifted its head as she passed, tail thumping once. Grace stopped. The man looked up, older now, lines deeper, eyes steadier. "Grace," he said, disbelief softening his voice. She smiled. "Hi, Ray." They sat together without hurry, talked about nothing important, everything important. At one point, Ray glanced at her uniform jacket folded beside her. "Still serving," he said. Grace nodded, just differently. He smiled. "Figures." When she stood to leave, Ray cleared his throat. "You know," he said, "that day you stood up, it didn't just change your life." Grace swallowed. "I know," she said quietly. Driving away, something settled inside her. Not closure, not peace. Permission. That night back in her quarters, Grace opened the folder. She read every page. In the morning, she called Gaines. "I'm in," she said. The work that followed was harder than any mission she'd flown or watched through a scope. There were meetings, resistance, people who wanted results without vulnerability. Grace held her ground the only way she knew how. She listened. She built spaces instead of speeches, protocols that allowed pauses, training that taught restraint as a skill, not a weakness. Progress was slow, uneven. Some days she went home exhausted, questioning everything. Other days, she watched a room full of people breathe easier simply, because no one demanded they be fixed. One evening, as she locked up after a long day, a young service member lingered by the door. "Ma'am," he said, "is it okay if I come back tomorrow?" Grace smiled. "It always is." As she turned out the lights, she felt it again, not heaviness this time. Resolve. She knew the path ahead would never be simple. But she also knew this. She had stopped measuring success by noise. She had learned to trust the quiet. And in that quiet, something strong was finally taking shape. Why did the room feel smaller the moment she was finally put in charge? Grace stood at the head of the table, palms resting flat against the smooth surface, feeling the weight of eyes instead of bullets. The room was filled, too filled. Suits, uniforms, civilian analysts with tablets open and brows permanently furrowed. This wasn't a briefing bunker or a field command post. This was policy space. The kind where words could be sharper than weapons if used the wrong way. This program, a man near the far end said, tapping his pen once for emphasis, has exceeded its pilot phase. That means oversight, metrics, standardization. Grace listened without interrupting. She always did. Another voice followed. We're concerned about scalability. What works because of you may not work without you. Grace felt that one land. She straightened slowly. Then we build it so it doesn't depend on me. Silence. She continued, measured. If the only thing holding this together is one person, then it was never strong to begin with. A woman across the table folded her arms. With respect, Captain, this approach is unconventional. Grace nodded. So were service dogs once. A few heads lifted. She didn't push further. She didn't need to. After the meeting, the room emptied in clusters. Conversations resumed without her, then stopped again as people passed. Grace gathered her papers methodically, shoulders tight. Leadership, she was learning, came with a different kind of isolation. Colonel Gaines lingered. They're afraid, he said quietly. Grace didn't look up. Of what? That they can't quantify what you do. Grace allowed herself a small, tired smile. Neither can I just know when it's missing. The program expanded anyway. Slowly, carefully. Sites opened near bases that had struggled most with retention, discipline issues, post-deployment incidents no one wanted to name out loud. Grace traveled constantly. She slept in spare rooms and temporary quarters, learned the rhythm of new places by the sound of doors closing at night. Each site was different. Each pain was the same. In one, a former pilot sat for hours staring at a blank wall, refusing to remove his helmet even indoors. Grace didn't ask him to. She just sat nearby, helmetless, present. In another, a young woman flinched at the sound of boots in hallways. Grace rearranged schedules so no one marched past her office. Small things. They added up. Still, resistance followed her everywhere. At a review in Virginia, a senior official pulled her aside. You're blurring lines, he said, between command and care. Grace met his gaze. Those lines were imaginary to begin with. He frowned. This isn't a cafe. Grace didn't flinch. No, it's where people come after everything else fails. That night, alone in a borrowed office, Grace sat with her notebook open, pen unmoving. The pages were filling faster now. Too many names, too many stories she couldn't forget even if she wanted to. Her chest tightened. She closed the notebook and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For the first time since she'd accepted the role, doubt crept in sharp and unwelcome. What if I'm wrong? What if kindness isn't enough here? The next morning answered her. A call came in before sunrise. One of the newer sites. A former EOD technician had barricaded himself in a supply building, armed, panicked, refusing contact. They're asking for you, the site director said. Again. Grace closed her eyes briefly. On the drive over, she felt the familiar hum of focus settle in, but beneath it, something else pulsed. Fear. Not of failure, of repetition. How many times could she step into the same moment and come out whole? The building was surrounded when she arrived, tactical units ready, orders waiting to be given. Grace raised a hand. Stand down, she said. A commander stepped forward, captain with respect. If we rush him, Grace said evenly, he dies or someone else does. Either way we lose. She walked forward alone. Inside, the air was stale and thick with sweat and oil. The man crouched behind crates, weapon trembling in his hands. "I'm not going back," he shouted when he saw her. "I can't." Grace stopped where she was, slow and deliberate. "I'm not here to take you anywhere," she said. "I just want to sit." He laughed, sharp and broken. "You think that fixes it?" "No," Grace replied. "I think it starts something." Minutes stretched, then more. Her legs ached. Her throat burned from careful words. Finally, the man lowered the weapon, not all the way. "Enough." "They said I was fine," he whispered. "They cleared me." Grace nodded. "They said that to me once too. They were wrong." "That did it." He broke then, folded inward like a structure that had held too much weight for too long. When it was over, when medics took over and the building emptied, Grace sat alone on the concrete floor. Her hands shook. She let them. Back at the site office, Gaines called. "You okay?" he asked. Grace hesitated. "I don't know how many more of these I can do." The line was quiet. "Then we change the load," Gaines said, "not the mission." That night, Grace made a decision she'd been avoiding. She couldn't carry every moment herself. She began training others, not just in procedures but in presence, teaching them how to sit without fixing, how to listen without defending, how to recognize when silence was safer than orders. Some didn't get it. Some did. The first time she watched one of them step into a crisis without her, Grace sat in a nearby room, heart pounding harder than it ever had during combat. It worked. Not perfectly, but well enough. Weeks later, she received an invitation she didn't expect. Washington. A review panel, high level. Recognition was the word used. Grace almost declined. Almost. The night before she left, she visited one of the centers quietly. No announcement, no entourage. A few veterans sat around a table, coffee cups in hand, a dog asleep under a chair. Grace leaned against the wall, unnoticed. She watched them talk or not talk. She watched shoulders ease, laughter slip in where tension used to live. This, she thought, this is why. In her hotel room later, she stood by the window overlooking a city that never slept and felt something she hadn't allowed herself in years. Pride. Not in herself. In what had grown beyond her. At the panel, questions came fast and sharp. What qualifies you? What's your end state? How do we ensure compliance? Grace answered simply. "I don't measure success by how quiet things look on paper," she said. "I measure it by how many people stop believing they're disposable." Some nodded, some didn't. When it ended, Grace walked out alone, unsure how it had landed. She didn't check messages until she was back at the airport. There was one from a number she didn't recognize. "Thank you for the coffee, I stayed." Grace closed her eyes. Sometimes the only proof you needed was survival. As her plane lifted into the night, Grace rested her head against the seat and finally let herself feel tired. Not broken. Not finished. Just human. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. Why did she feel the weight most when there was nothing left to prove? The plane touched down just after dawn, tires humming against the runway as the city slowly woke around it. Grace stayed seated long after others stood, her forehead resting lightly against the cool window. Below, the ground crews moved with practiced rhythm, signals, gestures, coordination without words. She understood that language. By the time she stepped into the terminal, her phone vibrated again. Messages stacked quietly, updates from the centers, small victories, hard nights. Someone asking if it was okay to bring their dog tomorrow, someone else saying they finally slept. Grace replied to none of them yet. She needed silence first. Back at the main site, the building felt different. Not louder, Not quieter, fuller, like a place that had learned how to hold what came through its doors. The whiteboard near the coffee station was covered in handwriting now. Who needs a ride? Who needs a listener? Who just needs to sit? Grace set her bag down and stood there reading it, chest tight in a way that didn't hurt. Colonel Gaines found her there. "You made an impression," he said. Grace smiled faintly. "That wasn't the goal." "I know," he replied. "That's why it mattered." They walked together through the center. Veterans nodded as they passed. Some smiled. Some didn't. Grace didn't expect them to. Presence didn't require performance. They stopped near the far wall, the one slowly filling with photographs. Not official portraits. Not awards. Just moments. People holding mugs. Dogs asleep under chairs. A hand resting on another hand like it was learning how to trust again. Grace reached into her bag and pulled out 2 photos. One was from Washington, a room full of people standing, clapping, faces blurred by motion and light. The other was older, softer, a cafe, a woman in an apron, a man with tired eyes, a dog at his feet. She pinned them side by side. No explanation. Gaines watched quietly. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't done it?" he asked. Grace didn't need clarification. "Yes," she said, "sometimes." "And?" Grace considered the question. "I think I'd still be alive," she said slowly, "but I don't think I'd be whole." That afternoon, she finally opened her messages. One stopped her. It was from the young lieutenant who'd once asked about hesitation. "Ma'am, I paused today. It worked." Grace closed her eyes. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the building emptied, Grace stayed behind. She wiped down counters, straightened chairs, not because anyone asked, because ritual mattered. When she finished, she stepped outside. The air was cool still. A figure sat on the steps. Ray. Older now, slower. Shadow's muzzle dusted with gray, but his eyes still sharp. Grace smiled. "You always had good timing." Ray chuckled softly. "Figured I owed you one last refill." They sat together as the sky deepened, sharing a thermos Ray had brought. The coffee was bad. Grace drank it anyway. "You know," Ray said after a while, "people think that day at the cafe was about rules, or dogs, or respect." Grace nodded. "It was." "It was about not being erased," he said quietly. Grace swallowed. Ray shifted, uncomfortable in the way men did when they got close to saying something important. "Shadow won't be around much longer," he added. "Vet says he's tired." Grace reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears. Shadow leaned into her touch like it was familiar. "He did his job," she said. "So did you," Ray replied. They sat until the light was gone. After Ray left, Grace remained on the steps, alone now, listening to the sounds of the bass settling for the night. Somewhere laughter, somewhere quiet grief. She thought of her husband then, not with sharp pain, with something gentler. She imagined him standing in the doorway of the cafe again, watching her move between tables, doing what she always did, making space. She imagined what he'd say now. Probably nothing. He never needed many words. Weeks later, the letter arrived. Official heavy paper sealed. Grace stared at it for a long moment before opening it. The language was formal, careful. National Civilian Commendation for distinguished service to veterans. An invitation, a ceremony, a speech. Grace laughed softly to herself. That night she wrote in her notebook. Not a name. Not a case. A sentence. "You stayed." The ceremony was smaller than she expected. No fanfare. No spectacle. Just a room full of people who understood what the words meant. When Grace stepped to the podium, she didn't bring notes. She didn't need them. "I don't wear a uniform," she said, "but I've learned that service doesn't always come with one. Sometimes it looks like a chair pulled out, or a rule bent, or a pause where someone expected a command. She let the room breathe. Years ago, I was fired for helping a veteran and his dog. I thought that moment ended something. I was wrong. It started everything. She didn't mention the missions, or the nights she almost quit, or the fear. She didn't have to. When the applause came, she accepted it the way she accepted everything else. Quietly. Back home, the center continued to grow without her constant presence. That was the point. Grace stepped back when she could, let others lead. One afternoon, a young woman stood near the door, hands clasped, eyes darting. "Is this the place?" she asked. Grace smiled gently. "Yes," she said, "you're safe here." The woman exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for years. Grace watched her sit down, watched a dog curl at her feet, watched the room adjust around them without instruction. That was when Grace knew. The mission was no longer hers alone. Late that night, alone in her quarters, Grace removed the photo of the cafe from the wall and placed it carefully into her notebook. She didn't need it there anymore. The cafe hadn't disappeared. It had multiplied. Grace lay back and closed her eyes. For the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel the need to be ready for anything. She had done enough. In a world that rewards noise, she had chosen quiet. In a system built on speed, she had honored pause. And in moments when dignity was easiest to ignore, she had protected it, again and again, without asking who was watching. Because sometimes, strength doesn't arrive with force. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.